For those of us in advocacy, we know change is the only constant, which is why we know the value of keeping your eye on the ball and knowing when to pivot to your strategy. Advocacy can't exist in a vacuum. It's about understanding the full political picture. You can't simply focus on your issue. You need to know what's at stake across the board, what's driving politicians, where the power lies, what the budget constraints are, which seats are critical, who's influencing the conversation. You can't advocate in isolation. You need to understand how all the pieces fit together. And the bigger picture that you see, the sharper your advocacy strategy will be. With the federal election coming up here in Australia, it's more than important than ever that we remain flexible in our strategies. Today, we'll explore the issues that matter to voters, look at what the polls are telling us, and talk about effective strategies for navigating this ever-changing environment. So I'm thrilled to be joined by two experts today, Steve Michelson, founder and managing director of Banksia Strategic Partners, a respected corporate advisor and campaign strategist with a wealth of experience spanning the private sector, politics and law. And we're also joined by Tony Barry, Director of Corporate Affairs and Communications at Redbridge Group Australia, a highly respected expert with over 25 years of experience in media management, communications, risk management and policy development. Thank you, Steve and Tony, for joining us here today. Just a quick admin thing. So I'll start with asking Steve and Tony some questions and we'll end with a Q&A from the audience. So if you can start popping in questions in the Q&A box, that would be great. Tony, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to ask you to grab your crystal ball. And can you tell us what everyone wants to know? When's the next federal election going to be?
Thanks, Elise. I think Labor are very wisely keeping a couple of clear options open. A no budget, no pre-election budget option, and a post-budget option where they campaign to the budget and dare the coalition to support it or oppose it. So those two dates realistically are the 12th of April, where the election would be called on the Monday following the WA election, or what is scheduled to be the WA election on the 8th of March. So writs would have to be issued by the Monday, the 10th of March. Well, there's a big debate at the moment with Roger Cook clearly, deliberately sort of skewering the Prime Minister about the changing of the date. But that would be called on the 10th of March. By the 10th of March, there would be no March 25 budget and the election on the 12th of April. The other alternative, I think, is the 17th of May, which would be 52 weeks since, almost 3 years exactly to the week. The 24th of May is a possibility, but there's an RBA meeting on the 20th of May. So that is big risk or big reward. And at the moment, a lot of the markets are indicating there'll be no interest rate cut until June. So a hold announcement from the RBA would probably be very bad for that final week of the campaign. I think they're probably the two most likely dates.
Okay. And so, Steve, whenever the election's finally called, we know that the day's headline will grab the spotlight, but some big issues are already shaping up to define the race. So what are the voters really carrying into the booth besides their democracy sausage? What's on their mind as they tick those boxes?
Yeah, thanks, Elise. Look, I think the simple answer to that question, good question, is cost of living, cost of living, cost of living. That is just permeating everything that's happening in our Australian democracy at the moment, and certainly at the federal level. So I think that more than ever before, cost of living is going to be front and centre of this campaign. Tony mentioned the RBA and the interest rates, which following the Trump victory last weekend shows that any relief the government was really hoping for in that regard is probably a bit far-fetched now. All the pundits and experts are talking about that now, interest rates easing in the second half of next year. So first and foremost, cost of living. I think secondly, national security will be an issue. And I think that the decision that surprised me, it didn't get as much media coverage as I was expecting, but I think almost certainly national security will be an issue in light of the couple of High Court decisions that we've seen, firstly in relation to the ending of mandatory detention for that group of people who were held offshore, who have got some of them pretty precarious histories, and then also the decision last week, which was around ankle bracelets. And refugee advocates are continuing to put all sorts of cases forward on behalf of their clients. And so almost certainly that will be an issue that, you know, sees through to the campaign, not least because I think opposition Peter Dutton will make it so. And look, I think thirdly after that, probably housing affordability and supply will be an issue for obvious reasons. So I think they're the big three. The other reflection I'll just make here briefly is that certainly on the Labor side, the Trump election victory in the US has really sent shockwaves through the party. I think everybody was waiting in a way to see who won that election, to know how they calibrated. But I was up in Canberra last week and saw some pretty stressed people walking around the building. The other issue I should just touch on briefly that I didn't mention is crime. We certainly know that in Queensland and the Northern Territory, crime was front and centre of those election campaigns, and also, frankly, front and centre in those Labor administrations losing their election. So I do think crime is something that will play out in a way on the federal stage, I think connected perhaps to the national security issue I touched on earlier. But we saw Peter Dutton in his budget reply speech, which albeit a couple of months old now, but he made the point of mentioning crime. And at that time, that was relative to the terrible attacks down at the Westfield shopping centre in Bondi Junction. But, you know, it's straight out of the coalition playbook to be talking about that issue.
Yep. And so, Tony, Steve mentioned cost of living pressures are top of mind for voters. And I think all of the issues that, you know, interest rates, crime, all of those have linked back to that, you know, the pressure, the pressure cooker that people are under at the moment. And we certainly saw that as how it played out in the US election. Given this challenging economic climate, how can people advocate, how can organisations advocate, and advocates best frame their issues to ensure they have that cut through that they need?
Yeah, I think to Steve's point, inflation is political kryptonite to incumbent governments. It just kills them. Every Western democracy, governments have flipped. So, you know, the orthodoxy is, particularly in Australia, every government gets at least one term, no matter how bad. So Rudd and Abbott governments, you know, even they got it re-elected effectively. So I think this is a very different ball game at the moment. There is intense economic pain in the electorate. We do focus groups every night, 2 or 3 focus groups every night, and the stories are confronting. And people are, there's a lot of grievance in the electorate. I mean, there's a lot of grievance that fuels a mood for change, and there's a strong mood for change. You might have heard with the American commentary, they talk about right track, wrong track, which is a diagnostic test for mood for change. In Australia, we typically use internal polling, right direction, wrong direction. We're currently in the field right now for a federal poll for News Corp, but we've been getting right track of in the mid-30s. So America was mid-20s, which is terribly low. When we were polling for John Howard, even in 2007 when he lost, the right track was around 60 to 65%. So massive move for change out there. So in terms of advocacy timing, I think I'd be working off the presumption of April 12. And if it's not, then, you know, there'll be a budget. The expenditure review committees usually sort of start, they're probably working right now. They'll need to have, because of the Charter of Budget Honesty, even if there is no budget, there'll have to be a set of numbers produced, which will tell us whether we're effectively in surplus or deficit. So it has to be a pretty compelling case for why you want this public policy change. And I'd be starting on that process ASAP, like tomorrow, because the calendar year is slipping away. There's 2 more sitting weeks to come, I think, the last 2 weeks, November. And then, you know, they're going to have to start locking away policies, and that includes the coalition as well. But they would be expecting to have their signature policies locked away, you know, if not this side of Christmas, you know, shortly thereafter.
Yeah. And Elise, I might just chime in. I agree with everything Tony said. I personally think, and I think Tony's absolutely right to advise to get ready for the 12th of April date, obviously with the view to falling back to the 17th of May, if that's what eventuates. But for what it's worth, I do think in a cost of living environment that we're in, I do think the government will hand down another budget, is my own view. There is mixed views on the Labor side about the merits of that, but I personally think that at the end of the day, the government, particularly the Prime Minister, will not be able to resist the temptation to be able to go out there and talk about cost of living relief. Now, in what form, all of that's got to be worked through. But I just think at the end of the day, all politicians of all stripes, in my experience, are pretty good at handing out candy at budgets and really kicking the can down the road, insofar as the knowledge that a lot of that stuff only feeds the inflation problems that we've got. The other call outs I wanted to make from Tony, I think absolutely right about, looking to engage now. And I think keeping a couple of things in mind. One is that, the show, as we refer to it, the political show, certainly up in Canberra, I referred to those stressed people walking around the place last week. The show on all sides of politics, whether it's Labor, Coalition, Green, other, absolutely is starting to focus on the upcoming election. And there are 2 more sitting weeks, but people are already spending time now preparing for the election, and the intensity of that will only increase. The other thing I just want to say here briefly is that it's worth organisations thinking about the distinction between kind of policy and funding commitments before the election and actually obtaining election commitments. Now, the two are very different, and for organisations who are able to kind of hit the ground running quickly to secure funding policy commitments, absolutely. Again, keeping in mind the fact that the show is starting to go to water insofar as focusing on the election. But always remember that political parties, particularly those running for government, are always looking for that sweet spot between good policy and good politics. So it is possible to go out and talk to decision makers about securing an election commitment. In other words, if elected, a return Albanese Labor government, if elected a Dutton coalition government, will deliver X. And of course, wherever possible, you want both sides to be signing up to that election commitment. Why? Because then ultimately you don't really care who wins the election, whether it be April or May next year.
Well, I'm going to be a bit self-indulgent here. Steve will attest to the fact that I am a massive energy policy nerd. So I obviously have to ask both of your thoughts on the debate around nuclear energy and how that's going to impact the next, not just the election, but the debate around the election. So I know that we're going to be talking a lot about cost of living, and I think we've seen that Dutton will, talk extensively around energy prices and how nuclear energy can bring down energy prices. But I want to know, what's that going to have? Both sides agree on net zero by 2050 still on the table. Do you think Australia can achieve that with a technostic approach, or are we going to head down this policy battle place again, which we haven't seen since the climate debate? Either of you can go.
I might kick that off because we've actually done some publicly available polling. The client has put it on their website, so I'm not divulging anything. They've briefed both federal opposition and federal government. Most Australians overwhelmingly do not believe we will hit emissions target currently. They're losing faith in the government's ability to deliver. And when you do focus groups with them, the reasons why they can't see any evidence of it, apart from solar panels on the roof, they haven't seen transmission. They can point to, say in Victoria, metro tunnel being built, the rail tunnel in Sydney. There's evidence to them that there's an agenda for infrastructure, and that they can point to signposts. Whereas with energy, renewable energy, all they see is press releases. Well, they don't even see the press releases. They're aware there's a lot of talk about it, but they're not seeing any action. So they're losing faith in the Victorian government on renewable energy and the federal government on renewable energy. I think the Trump win changes the dynamics enormously because Trump will, tear up every international agreement the Americans are involved in. He'll switch gas back on, the Keystone gas pipeline. And the one argument that the renewable energy sector, and I do a lot of work for renewable energy, the one argument the renewable energy sector has that works for them in Australia is that, Australia needs to be with the rest of the world on this. We don't want to fall behind the rest of the world. Well, when India, China, and America aren't signatories or involved or making any effort to cut emissions, that punches a massive hole in one of your sort of arguments. And at the same time, people, they're seeing their. We all know the energy debate is gargantuan as a public policy, but people just, I mean, I barely understand it, and I spend 2 or 3 days a week working on it. Tony Wood, I think, is probably the only person who holistically understands it. Um, People just see their bills and they're going up, and so they go, well, renewable energy isn't cheaper. And I know that's a very simplistic, but that's people are evidence-based, and so they're losing faith in it. So public support is softening for renewable energy. Um, and I think at the moment, cost of living is so pervasive that the nuclear energy debate is just not landing at all. Now, I think there's a massive scare campaign there, massive, and we still may yet see it, but none of Labor's arguments are landing on that at the moment. Um, and it might be the case, as I said, that cost of living is so pervasive that nothing else really matters at the moment, that people are literally living week to week.
I might just add to that, Elise. I think they're all good reflections. I think just briefly an anecdote. I went to a business lunch earlier in the year, and I honestly can't remember the time, but it was certainly when things around Dutton's nuclear energy policy were heating up, and Alicia Loxley, Channel 9 reporter, had him on stage and was asking about the policy and sort of needling him. And I think the one thing that we forget, and certainly based on that experience, is how persuasive he can be on this topic. He is an incredibly seasoned seasoned operator, and so much so, and rest assured, I stuck to the Labor talking points, but so much so that I was at the end of the lunch walking out thinking to myself, gosh, I feel like I might, seriously need to have a think about my support for nuclear energy. So Dutton is not to be underestimated. He is incredibly effective, and I think eminently electable. I also think when it comes to the nuclear debate, he has done a almost, perfect job in a way of managing his internal affairs in terms of his caucus. Certainly there are some members who have had announcements made about their electorates. They're certainly not running out, cheering from the sidelines on this topic or talking about it in an overt way. But I am surprised that he does not have more breakouts in his caucus on this topic. The only other reflection I want to make on this, and I think Tony said it well, which is I have got no doubt that there is a well-honed scare campaign coming on this from Labor, as sure as night follows day. And in fact, some of the conversations I have had would suggest that actually they have deliberately kept their powder dry on that, with the knowledge that there's an election campaign coming. The one thing, though, that Albo's got to watch a little bit, though, in this space is not to be going so negative that it actually diminishes his attempt to be able to speak to the Australian public about what his second term agenda would be. If there's one thing that we know, it's that Australians have a deep dislike and scepticism about politics generally. And, I'm sure that if we had optional voting in Australia, we all know how it would go in terms of voter turnout. So, at a time when he's got to go out in a pretty difficult environment and persuade Australians to give him another term on the basis of his bright, future-focused vision, he's got to just calibrate this debate carefully. And I think he's got to make sure that he's got the right people coming out as the attack dogs on this against the coalition, and to make sure, though, that that doesn't interrupt his ability to try and sell his second-term vision.
Thank you. So I'm going to jump to, we mentioned polling, Tony mentioned polling quite a fair bit, and I'd like to sort of go to that a little bit more depth. So as I sort of touched on earlier, the polls are just one of the many ways we can gauge the mood of the electorate, but they certainly help us understand where people stand, and you certainly do a lot of work in this field. So could you share what the numbers are showing us at this point in the election cycle? And if I can be a bit cheeky, do you think our polls will be more reliable than what we recently saw in the US?
Yeah, well, in America, one of the problems is there's actually hundreds of polling available, and some of it is questionable. There is a bit of a conspiracy theory that some of them were sort of deliberately sort of set up by Republican-friendly or Democrat-friendly polling companies to try and drive their media cycle and expectations and so forth. But more fundamentally, polling in America has always been very difficult because there's the get out the vote. It's voluntary voting. So you can ask, are you a registered voter? Then you can ask if you intend and expect to vote. But even then, there's still, they might not decide to vote in the end, or they might change their mind, or they might not be a registered voter and just have answered yes. So there's a lot of variables that start making it a little bit hard. And I think there was a shy Trump vote. And there's that often is the case where it's a little bit controversial and people sort of don't want to really sort of, put forward their opinion, even if it's online. Um, so I think there's a couple of elements there. In terms of Australia, I think, I think there's a narrow path to defeat for Albanese still, but the problem is he's walking that path with great surety and determination. And I think, every month that goes by, economic pain increases. Every month without an RBA cut, the pain increases. And I would not rule out a Dutton coalition victory at all, or a Dutton. I mean, he still needs to win 18, 19 seats. That's a huge, huge effort. But he's polling. Most public polling, including ours, has him at around 40 to 38%. He probably really needs to be 42, 43. It's very difficult for the coalition to win unless they really hit. I mean, 45 is the magic number for the coalition primary vote, but it's been done with 42, 43. I think under Hanson in 98. Howard did it with 39, but there was a huge One Nation vote, which mostly went back. But I'm starting to think that Peter might get there, actually. I'm starting to sort of feel that the tide is turning against Albanese very fast. He's under pressure. He's making mistakes. And he needs a rate cut, not just for the relief that will provide homes, whether it be renting or mortgage, but it's a signpost. When we talk about in focus groups, people use these as evidence or signposts. So if there is a rate cut, say there's 3 RBA meetings in the first half of next year, February 18th, April 1st, which you can already see the headlines if there's no rate cut on April the 1st, and then May 20th. If there's a rate cut and markets don't expect that, Albo will say, well, our economic plan is working. So re-elect us so we can finish the job. But if there's no rate cut, I don't know. I don't know what he says. He's running out of lines that are going to be effective.
And I think this goes to sort of our next question. So when we're working with clients, one of the first things we do is identify key stakeholders. Steve Tony's just indicated that there's, potentially going to be a change of government, that things are going to change. Keeping that in mind, but also more broadly, love to hear your insights on who the key players are in the current political landscape. So obviously the PM, the opposition leader, are top of mind, but who are the people that have the ear of the leaders, and who do organisations need to start talking to get things done?
Yeah, absolutely, Elise. And there's a number of different aspects to that question. But look, just in short, I mean, obviously, portfolio ministers and shadow ministers remain incredibly important. But as you've touched on, and as we head into the election cycle, really everything gets more and more centralised into the leaders' office on both sides. And so, making sure that relationships with staff are held really tightly and nurtured is incredibly important. And again, just touching on my reflection earlier around the kind of show going to water, and by that I mean, just the pressure building, people, working longer hours than they already work, people being pulled in different directions, people being on the road more than they've been previously. It's really important to have cut through and to have relationships. This is the time when relationships really matter. I think the other couple of reflections would be the campaign directors. So on the Labor side, Paul Erickson, very, very seasoned operator. He's obviously the campaign director who took Albo to victory in the 2022 election. And on the other side, Andrew Hurst, who as a long-serving coalition campaign director, which I'm sure Tony would speak more about authoritatively than me, but both very, very seasoned operators. And one thing that we've started to do a little bit with clients is actually to not only be engaging in our government relations with the leaders at their offices, with the ministers and their offices or shadow ministers, but also to be talking a little bit more at a political level. So speaking to the campaign HQs about various things that might be happening, and various strategic objectives of our clients, which might actually be of interest to them at a political level. And again, that's all about trying to find that sweet spot between good policy and good politics. The only final two reflections I make briefly is coalitions of support now are more important than before. And the reason for that is because, at the end of the day, everyone is thinking about how they can capitalise on the upcoming election cycle. So if you've got partnerships with peak bodies, other stakeholders, other like-minded organisations, now is the time to be building those coalitions of support among stakeholders to get that cut through. And importantly, though, to be getting cut through in a way where you can still preserve an organisation's unique strategic objectives. They don't have to be diluted, they don't have to be shared, but it is about giving weight, if you like, to your particular idea or agenda. And the final thing I'd just say is that we would be saying to clients in the lead up to this part of the cycle, just to be handling the media with care. As people are thinking about the upcoming election, they are more tired, more stretched than they ordinarily. What also happens is people having a heightened awareness of media. And so while we always dovetail communications in with our government relations strategies, we just say in the lead up to elections, just to really, approach the media with even more caution than you normally do, just so you don't have the unintended impact of, irritating people or putting people on the wrong side.
Yeah, I just think on the coalition side, Hursty, obviously quite influential. He and I used to share an office 15 years ago in the opposition rooms. He's very good. But I'd also put on your list Jamie Briggs, who's very personally close to Peter. And he's been brought back. He was a partner at PwC, and then its successor, the consulting arm. But Jamie, the Fin Review reported recently, sold his share, and he's working in FedSec. So he's not on the taxpayer payroll, but he's working at FedSec. And he's the kind of interface between Peter, because he understands how Peter thinks, and Hursty. And also, Jamie's had a fair exposure to business over the last 6 years, I think, since he left Parliament. Jamie's a highly influential figure. So I think, he doesn't understand the intersection between policy, media, and politics. A couple of the other people that are highly influential are James McGrath, who's probably not very well known to a lot of people, but he is Peter's consigliere, and you can always tell it's a bit of a Labor thing. He could have been in shadow cabinet, but because there's only so many, and he has such internal power, he's one of those sort of people who he's the assistant shadow minister to the opposition leader. So he's Peter's consigliere. But he was the campaign director when Campbell Newman won, I think, 78 out of 88 seats or something extraordinary.
Yeah.
He was Boris Johnson's campaign director when he was Lord Mayor. James is a great retail politician, and he is currently travelling around the country auditing all these campaigns to make sure that they're up to scratch on behalf of Peter and reporting back. So he's a highly influential figure as well. And the other point I make about Peter is, and I've been friends with him for 25 years, he's very good at listening to lots of people. He's not sort of echo chamber. He talks to everybody from Peter Credlin, John Howe. I mean, a whole spectrum of people from the left and the right of the party. Simon Birmingham, who doesn't share a lot of Peter's policy prescriptions. Peter relies on him enormously as well because he represents that part of the party, and that's why Peter's authority internally is basically, he's got 2 terms if he wants it, because he's very popular internally.
I might also just add, Elise, and I should say James McGrath, also my former sparring partner on Sky News. So of course I would debate his retail political abilities. No, I'm only joking. But look, on the Labor side, I think a couple of things. People like Tim Ayres, the Minister for Trade, New South Wales left, Andrew Giles from Victoria, who I think it's fair to say had a bit of a rough trot out of the immigration portfolio, but still very much a confidant of the Prime Minister. And then in Queensland, Murray Watt, who was a beneficiary of the last reshuffle. They're all kind of people who I describe as Albo's Praetorian Guard. And then, of course, have to mention Penny Wong, who some would say, is really the next closest person to the Prime Minister, and Katie Gallagher as well. All of those people make up the inner sanctum of the PM. I would just say, and without any disrespect, but it's interesting hearing Tony's reflections about Peter and talking and listening. And I think, broadly speaking, the PM has that skill as well. But I do think there's a growing concern on the Labor side around the echo chamber. And I think the shift there probably was born from the failed Voice campaign. I think on the Labor side, people would recognise that it's been a bit of a turning point where there was a lot of time and effort spent on that campaign, on that yes vote, and appropriately so for lots of good reasons. But during a cost of living crisis, I think then when that campaign was unsuccessful, and not surprisingly, people were talking about it being unsuccessful several weeks out from the actual voting day. But I think then that really shifted the dynamic on the Labor side internally, and I think then people have had growing criticisms about the Prime Minister's and his office and their ability to listen to what's happening out on the ground. So, interesting dynamic.
You've both spoken at length about sort of some of the more high-profile people in government. We know that there's big teams underneath politicians. All three of us have had the immense privilege of working in political offices. Privilege and pain as well on both sides of the aisle, but for the vast majority of people, political offices are a bit of a mystery. It's like one of the people's favorite barbecue questions for me. What was it like? What do you do? Without getting into the nitty gritty, how do these offices actually work behind the scenes, and what's the best way for, in a professional sense, for organisations to engage with them, and particularly during an election cycle? So in the next few months, how do you engage with the staffers to make sure that you're being heard? Who wants to jump in?
You want to go first, Tony? Or
So you can kick off, Steve. Yeah.
look, I think from a once upon a time scout and borrowing motto, it's about being prepared. You have to be prepared. And going into an election, the focus is just ruthlessly on winning. It's ruthlessly on winning votes, and people are more and more time poor than ever before. And it's about being prepared and making sure that your idea, your proposition is giving a soft landing. So, for example, to really be clear about where a proposition fits into a commitment that the government has made or the opposition may have made, now is not the time to be coming in with new complex ideas. And I think the ideas that help government save money are the ideas that are advanced the easiest. Just because, as Tony referenced earlier, the expenditure review committee process is well and truly advanced. I think the other thing is to be respectful of staffers and their time, and acknowledging that it can take a couple of goes to get traction, to get getting a meeting and having the conversation is often the easy part. It's about actually then being a little bit patient and being willing to try 2 or 3, 4 times sometimes to actually, get an idea and to give that idea legs. And I think being respectful of the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, things more and more are centralised in the lead up to a campaign through the leader's office, through Campaign HQ. And of course, each party will set up their own campaign infrastructure. But I think importantly, while being respectful of that, also thinking about some of those influential people that Tony and I outlined, and thinking about how do you utilise some of those relationships. And a really good example of that is I was doing a project in the lead up to the 2022 election when a client came to me 3 months out from the election, said they wanted to do a new sporting facility in Central Australia. And, there was no business case. There was no work that had been done before it came to us. And so we were really clear in setting expectations with the client around the fact that, you know, progressing it would be relatively unlikely. However, what we were able to do in this particular case was to get the AFL on board, who's obviously a very big stakeholder, be a very big, powerful stakeholder when it came to the then opposition, and of course the then Morrison government as well. And while we didn't get the particular proposition over the line, we were able to move pretty quickly to, as I've said a couple of times, find that sweet spot between good policy and good politics. So again, thinking about which stakeholders can be brought on board at this point in the cycle to help take an idea forward is pretty important. So there's a couple of reflections. Over to you, Tony.
Yep. And look, opposition is even less staff. And in some ways, you know, if you can see a member of parliament, you know, if not the shadow minister, people like James McGrath, but your pitch has to be razor sharp. You know, it has to very much, as Stephen said, anything that saves money is going to get their attention, or that has a real cost of living frame. And so that's got to be your lead when you pitch. You know, the cost this is going to save, you know, Australians this amount. The other point I would make is nothing sort of gets politicians' attention more than not just that frame, but saying these are the third-party endorsements that will come out in support of this. Because, you know, when you're looking, there's nothing quite like telling a politician this is a policy, and you know, they go over the bunker, they go over the sort of precipice, and they take 3 bullets in the chest, and you know, the body slumps down into the bunker, and they, you know, everybody's like, boy, yeah, that wasn't very good. Saying, look, you know, we'll roll out these industry groups or these individuals who are prepared to come out and endorse your position, will get their attention.
I want to go back to what you said, Tony, earlier. So the opposition needs about 18 to 19 seats to win government. We're delving into a bit more of the intricate side of politics now, so you know I'll pull it back after this and get back to the strategy. But I'd really love to hear your thoughts on the role of key seats. You know, why do these electorates and the issues that resonate them hold so much significance? Why do voters and concerns in those areas? Why are they so critical to the outcome of an election? And then just as a supplementary, what do you think is the makeup of the next federal parliament? You know, just again, crystal ball gazing.
Yep. So Australia's becoming a nation of smaller and smaller tribes. You know, when I first started in politics in the mid-90s, it was all pretty homogenous. They were all Labor versus coalition contests, all of them. You know, even 15 years ago, the Greens, you know, they had a higher than usual primary vote in the federal seat of Melbourne against Lindsay Tanner. He still used to get through. But, you know, all 150 seats and then 151 seats were Labor versus coalition. And then suddenly, you know, the rise of Greens, I mean, they won 3 federal seats in Queensland, which as a native Queenslander, I find mind-blowing. So this tribalism means there's a lot of different sort of contests. There's obviously Teals versus Liberals. There's Liberals versus Labor. There's Independents versus Labor, Greens versus Labor. So there's about 5 or 6 different contests happening all around Australia, which makes it very complex. I think it's fair to say Dutton is pitching to the outer suburbs. He's from the outer suburbs. He's been winning his seat in the outer suburbs, which was Cheryl Kernow's seat. He won it from Cheryl Kernow. He's been winning it for 25 years. So, and no disrespect to the Prime Minister, but he's from Leichhardt, and that's his comfort zone, I think. So Peter understands the outer suburbs, and that's where he's pitching his message. And I think Labor are vulnerable in a lot of those seats. So Blair, which is around Ipswich, we did an MRP for News Corp recently on mood sentiments. You know, do you think young people can buy a house without family support, bank of mum and dad? Are you feeling secure in your financial retirement? And do you think your standard of living will be better or worse in 5 years' time than it is now? Blair was in the bottom 10 of 150 seats in all of them. And so that's a seat that could be under threat. But there's a lot of those outer suburban seats where, you know, Labor's base are feeling a little bit left behind. That that, Albanese hasn't been focused on their cost of living pain. The Voice is kind of their evidence of that, there was off this sort of, trendy sort of issue and not sort of focused on my needs. Now, whether, the coalition tried in Dunkley by-election, and it's fair to say it wasn't a roaring success. They made some ground, but they did not win the seat. And that is your classic outer suburban seat based around Frankston. So, there's the coalition still has a lot of work to do, but it's those seats they're targeting. The Teal seats will be interesting. There's nothing to suggest those Teal members will lose. I think Curtin, but that's a WA thing, and Goldstein, but there's certain demographic issues at play there where the Liberals could pick that seat up. But I think the other seats, there's nothing to suggest yet, but the coalition will be running very hard in those seats on a vote for Monique Ryan is a vote for Anthony Albanese. And that's a pretty powerful message to those soft Liberals who don't like Labor, who think Monique Ryan is a soft Liberal or a moderate Liberal. So they're going to be under sustained pressure. And the coalition will also be running an argument that a minority Labor Teals government is economic chaos. And, people in Kooyong and Wentworth, they're highly leveraged. This idea that they're all sort of swimming around in pools of money is a little bit overblown. Some of them are very leveraged. And so the general health of the economy is really important to them. So there's some of the considerations there. And I think, the smart money says it'll be a Labor Teals minority government. But yeah, you wouldn't rule out the coalition sneaking in or with the support of Qatar or something like that.
Yeah, I think I agree with those reflections. I think the real lesson out of the US election for Labor is this idea of, as Tony says, focusing more, if not entirely, on the suburban issues as opposed to the inner urban issues. And there is a real distinction. And I think what we saw with Trump was this ability to really speak and resonate to America's working poor. And that's why we saw such massive shifts in relation to the Latino vote primarily, but a little bit of the black vote as well. And I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned in a cost of living crisis in the Australian setting from what we saw in the US. And I think, we'll see a recalibration of policies accordingly. I think Tony's framing of the sort of coalition be Teal, Labor versus Greens is right. A lot of people on the Labor side are feeling pretty up and about at the minute around the Greens vote going backwards, whether that's, in the Queensland election, whether it's in the council elections here in Victoria over the last couple of weeks. So that is something that people are very interested in. I think it gives Peter Khalil some glimmer of hope in Wills, where he had a pretty terrible redistribution. And it's worth noting the redistribution is mixed around the country. The only other final reflection I was going to make here is it's been alarmingly quiet from Clive Palmer, from a guy who spent through the roof in the lead up to the 2010 election, which obviously I remember particularly well, given that was the election that Bill Shorten lost quite unexpectedly. And then he had some presence in 2022, but since then we haven't seen a lot. So I've got no doubt that he will come out and run candidates in the elections in certain parts of the country. I don't think he'd be able to resist temptation, and certainly he's got the resources to do so. But the big unknown is whether or not he actually has any electoral success. He fell flat last election, but I think that's the other party just worth shining a light on in this conversation.
Just to Stephen's point about the Greens, we are finding in a lot of our research, because it's a big phenomenon, and we're in the field right now for News Corp on that. What we're finding is it's the older Green voters are falling off them. It's being replaced by some first-time voters. But a lot of those older voters find the new Greens very confronting. So they liked Dr. Bob Brown and Christine Mill and Dr. Richard Di Natale. They found them comforting. But they find the Adam Bange, Sarah Hanson-Young, and Lydia Thorpe, and I know she's an independent, but the Greens own her. They pre-selected her twice for a state and a federal seat. They find that very confronting. and just in focus groups, even people who are avowed Republican, as in not constitutional monarchists, avowed Republicans found her conduct with the King very unbecoming, confrontational, unnecessary, rude, and so they've got a real problem. And I can see them a bit like the old Democrats who they effectively replaced, having peaked and then sort of on the way out.
Very interesting. Look, I'm going to go now to some of the questions in our Q&A, just because I'm mindful of time, and I can keep talking. I could do this all day. Sorry, that's absolutely what I love. So Brett's asked, what major policy announcements or policy implementation, for example, immigration, can we expect before Christmas?
I just think a lot. Yeah, they'll do immigration tactically because it's a point of differentiation from Albanese. Um, and Peter, that's his bread and butter, the strong man. I mean, he also uses it to sort of say, I'll make the tough decisions. But that's more tactical. It's just going to be cost of living. If you're not in that game, and I think, what Albanese is doing with social media, there's probably some compelling, with children having access to it, there's some compelling reasons. It's certainly a big issue in our research with parents. Absolutely a big issue, but it's not the main game. So I'm not sure how many votes he's getting out of that. So I would expect there'll be some cost of living policy relief policies and so forth.
I think, at least just on immigration, there is really robust work that's been done to prepare for any further hurdles that might be thrown up for the government vis-a-vis the High Court, particularly on these group of detainees who have got into the community. Again, as I mentioned earlier last week, the High Court ruled that they could not have blanket, ankle bracelets applied. It had to be done by individual applications. And I think what we saw last week, and I think, Tony Burke, as the now responsible minister, has really learned the lesson of being caught flat-footed when that first decision came out. And so there's a lot of contingency planning that's being done in that regard. And I think what you'll see in the next 2 weeks is nothing necessarily proactive on that, because the laws have passed that give Tony the authority that he needs for now. But I think what you'll find is that the government will have a very, very, low risk threshold when it comes to those matters. And if it needs to be making decisive announcements, if it needs to be even thinking about recalling Parliament, if required, then I think all of those options will well and truly be on the table. And the other thing that's happened in the last couple of weeks is in the Attorney General's department, there's been a real rocket put under government lawyers to get that paperwork sorted in relation to how those individual detainees are being handled. And I think the one thing that Labor probably has to watch a little bit in this space is that, like all political parties, it'll be pre-selecting candidates, yes, in all of the seats that it holds, but also in the seats that it doesn't hold. And invariably it reaches into the party membership to do that here and there. And I think that, throughout the upcoming election campaign, it's got to watch pretty carefully how it manages those. Because on the one hand, in an election campaign and obviously signing up to be a candidate for the Labor Party, there's a certain discipline that is there. But for Labor candidates who might be running in non-held seats that are contests against the Greens, it wouldn't be the first time where there's been issues for the Labor Party in an election setting where its candidates have come out and actually actively pushed back on the government's policy when it comes to asylum seekers and refugees. So that'll be something the government has to manage pretty carefully through its campaign infrastructure.
Let me go to a question I found really interesting, and it's more about the sort of the mechanics of advocacy. So what sense of policy impact is compelling these days? So our return on investment used to work, a dollar spend returns $10. But these days, is it jobs created or is it just simply popularity with the electorate? Tony, what do you reckon?
It's people are becoming very evidence-based. They're switching off kind of so-called experts, saying, "Oh, this will reduce," which I think is one of the dangers for Labor on nuclear energy, is saying, "Oh, experts say this." Well, people have been listening to these experts on renewable energy, and they're becoming highly skeptical about everything at the moment. So it has to be a credible third-party source, and there's usually nothing more credible than real people. So Vox Pops, whatever you want to call it, but real people talking about how this improves their lives or the community benefit or the personal benefit is really important. So I think, that sort of underpins everything at the moment. Yeah.
Steve, did you have anything on that? Otherwise, I've got two more questions, and then we're gonna shoot through them, and then because we've got 7 minutes left. There's two good ones left.
Let's go to the last two, I think.
All right. So David's asked, given the focus on cost of living, are we going to get any action on solutions to fill skills shortages through targeted migration pathways? If not, how will key industries such as aged care, horticulture, energy, how will they all cope?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, David. And I think that what we're seeing from the major political parties on this topic is pretty concerning. Not surprising in that cost of living crisis that we're in, but I do think it's pretty concerning. And one thing that we've done with clients in a couple of examples is to actually go and have more tailored conversations with the government about their particular needs. And there are these sort of headline positions when it comes to skilled migration. I'd kind of fold into that the issue of international students as well. And I think that is absolutely no surprise heading into the election cycle. But it is, I think, interesting that behind closed doors, beneath the surface, there are ways to progress those pressure points with the government. And I think the government well understands the limitations of its own policy on some of this. And I think, further to what we've spoken about on this webinar, it's about utilising the various tactics, making the case. I think when you think, for example, around aged care, and you're talking about a vulnerable cohort of people, being able to go in there and illustrate the practical ways in which people and organisations just need skilled migrants to make sure that people are getting fed and bathed and looked after on time. All of that and all of those tactics, I think, are incredibly important when trying to make headway in those areas. Because I do think that over the next couple of months, when it comes to issues around permanent migration, issues around international students, unfortunately, I think both political parties will really bunker down and be happy to have a contest about those matters.
Yeah. On polling, and we didn't release this because it was a bit too provocative, but we didn't want it to be misused. Because I'm personally a big population guy. I think, we've got a skills shortage. We're not going to pay off debt without increasing GDP. And the easiest way to increase GDP is a bigger population. But our polling showed that 65% of Australians think that increased housing prices is related to immigration rates. So it's just a red hot button issue. Agree with Stephen, both parties are going to be trying their best to look like they're trying to suppress immigration rates. I think that's very poor public policy, but I understand why. But I think it makes it more incumbent to come back to what I was saying before, where various sectors are out there advocating for it. Because I think one of the great failures of both sides of politics in government has been a failure to articulate why a bigger population is better. And so consequently, without, and no one in the various sectors have been out there either. Everybody's been sitting back, sort of hoping that Nancy and Harry Stringbag living in Ringwood are suddenly going to turn around and say, actually, I think I'm for a bigger immigration policy. So it's incumbent on not just politicians, but, various businesses and sectors to get out there and argue the case.
So I'm going to end with one of, a question that we've sort of answered all the way through, but I feel like I just want two key things from each of you. So how will the US election result affect the Australian election? And are there any specific learnings for Australian politics or politicians and those engaged in advocacy efforts? So jump in.
Maybe I'll start on that and then throw to Tony. I mean, I think that other than the reflection I made earlier around from the Labor perspective, talking about suburban versus urban issues and what flows from that. I mean, the other massive call out's got to be, what does Trump do vis-a-vis China and tariffs in China, and what impact does that have, on the local political debate and our economy? And while some of that will wash through, in time, and certainly perhaps not, any new policy settings not take full impact until after our federal election. We know that even today, Trump is making announcements around his new cabinet, and what will then flow is that those relevant cabinet members will make policy announcements about what they intend to do, and all of that will impact on our markets and on what the RBA says in its upcoming decisions, and therefore have an impact on the local political debate. So I think that's got to be something. I think that's probably the main one. The other big lesson out of the US election, other than that kind of suburban versus urban piece for Labor.
Yeah, I think, look, don't profess to be the most financially illiterate person, but it's already obvious that the American dollar is going up. Tariffs and so forth will drive that further up, despite the broader problems it causes the American economy long term. If the American dollar goes up, the Australian dollar inevitably goes down. People sort of start buying the American dollar. That means our imports go up, which drives inflation up. I just cannot see an interest rate cut in the first half of next year. And that's going to have a big impact on Albanese. And I think, people love to dissect the American election and so forth, but fundamentally it was a change election. As I said, there was a strong wrong track. And she was a hopeless candidate and she didn't represent change. It's as simple as that. I think, there's a lot of hand-wringing going on, but if they had had a decent candidate who represented change, could have been a different result. Because Trump's actual raw vote didn't actually increase. I think it was 72 million. And I think last time was 72 million, but their vote collapsed, and people, when people are hurting, and I mean, her fatal mistake was that famous interview where she said she wouldn't change a single thing that Biden did. It was with The View. It was supposed to be a foot rub, that interview, and it killed her. So I think, the real lessons here are the Albanese government is under enormous pressure. I still think it's his election to lose, but he certainly looks like he's trying to sometimes. And the interest rate, the RBA, are going to be so influential over this election result.
We're all hoping for interest rate cuts. That's very sad news, Tony, that not till June next year, personally, but that's okay. Well, thank you so much once again to both of you, to our excellent speakers, Steve Buxton and Tony Barry, for sharing your insights today. Thank you all for joining us and for your great questions. As we wrap up, I hope we've left you with a clearer picture of how to approach your own advocacy work and what you need to do to sort of get your thoughts across. If you enjoyed today's session, be sure to tune into our podcast, A Cuppa of Thoughts, very short little podcast where we talk about topics like these. And we're always here to help, so don't hesitate to reach out if you need further support. So thanks all and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.